The year was 1018. In the cold shadows of an Icelandic farmstead, a pregnant woman named Guðrún Ósvífrsdóttir stood by a stream, washing blood-stained linens. Her hands moved mechanically through the frigid water as screams echoed from the wooden building behind her. Inside, her husband Bolli was fighting for his life against a group of armed men seeking revenge. When the violence ended, Bolli lay dead, his entrails spilling from a gaping wound. But the horror had only just begun. Helgi Hardbeinsson, the man who had run Bolli through with his spear, walked calmly to where Guðrún stood. Without a word, he took the bloodied tip of his weapon and wiped it clean on her shawl, the very fabric that covered her swollen belly. As the warm blood of her murdered husband stained the cloth protecting her unborn child, Helgi smiled coldly and spoke words that would haunt the centuries. "The one who will avenge his father's death," he said, pressing the spear tip against her pregnant stomach, "is already growing in there." Guðrún looked into his eyes and smiled back, not with joy, but with the terrible promise of a mother who had just witnessed the ritual marking of her unborn son for a life of violence and revenge. This was not an act of madness. It was Viking law made flesh. What happened to Guðrún that day was not an isolated incident of cruelty. It was part of a systematic approach to pregnancy, captivity, and royal bloodlines that the Viking world had refined over centuries. The wiping of a murderer's blade on a pregnant woman's clothing was a deliberate ritual, a way of binding the unborn child to a destiny of vengeance before it even drew breath. But this was only the beginning of what Vikings believed they could do to the bodies and souls of pregnant women, especially those of royal blood who had fallen into their hands. Recent archaeological research published in 2025 has revealed that Viking treatment of pregnant captives, particularly those of noble or royal status, followed patterns so systematic and brutal that they defy modern comprehension. The pregnant body, in Viking understanding, was not just a vessel for new life. It was a battlefield for control over bloodlines, inheritance, and the very concept of royal legitimacy. What follows is documented historical truth, drawn from the sagas, legal codes, and burial evidence of medieval Scandinavia. Each practice described was not only real, but considered legally and socially acceptable within Viking society. The treatment of defeated pregnant queens was designed to be worse than death, because in the Viking mind, there were fates that transcended the mere ending of life. This is the story of what those fates entailed. Scene 2. The ritual of blood marking. The practice witnessed in Guðrún's story had a name in Old Norse society: Blóðmerking, blood marking. According to the Laxdæla saga, and corroborating legal texts from medieval Iceland, when a pregnant woman of noble birth was present during the killing of her husband or male relatives, the killer was legally permitted to perform this ritual. The process was deliberate and laden with supernatural significance. The murderer would take his weapon, still warm with the victim's blood, and draw it across the pregnant woman's clothing, specifically over her belly. This act was believed to mark the unborn child with an obligation for revenge that would follow them throughout their entire life. But the blood marking was more than symbolic. Viking legal codes, particularly those recorded in the Icelandic Grágás, specified that a child marked in this way became what was known as a skuldskekkja, a debt-bearer. From the moment of birth, such children were legally bound to seek vengeance against their father's killers, regardless of their own wishes or circumstances. The horror deepened when the pregnant woman was not merely a witness, but a captive taken in raids against foreign royalty. Archaeological evidence from burial sites across Scandinavia suggests that pregnant queens and princesses captured during Viking raids were subjected to blood-marking rituals that went far beyond individual revenge. According to Dr. Marianne Hem Eriksson's 2025 research, these rituals were designed to corrupt the royal bloodline itself. When Viking raiders captured a pregnant foreign queen, they would sometimes perform mass blood-marking ceremonies. Multiple warriors would take turns wiping their weapons on the woman's belly, each one claiming a portion of the unborn child's loyalty. The child, if it survived to birth, would grow up bearing the spiritual debt to numerous Viking families, a living symbol of conquest that could never truly belong to its mother's people again. The Heimskringla records at least 3 instances where pregnant queens captured from Ireland, Scotland, and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms underwent these rituals. In each case, the children born from these pregnancies grew up in Viking households, raised to be weapons against their own ancestral kingdoms. They became what the sagas called modersvikari, mother betrayers, royal children turned against their own bloodlines through prenatal conditioning. The ritual was considered so powerful that even decades later, when these marked children had become adults, they were legally compelled to honor the blood debts imposed before their birth. The saga of Egil Skallagrimsson mentions a man named Thorstein, born to a captured Irish princess, who spent 30 years of his adult life hunting down and killing members of his own mother's royal family because he had been blood-marked as a fetus. The systematic exploitation of pregnant captives reached its most horrific expression in the specialized slave markets that operated throughout the Viking world. According to historical records from Dublin, York, and Constantinople, pregnant women, especially those of royal or noble birth, commanded prices up to 10 times higher than ordinary female slaves. But they were not purchased for their potential as mothers. Medieval Arabic sources, including the writings of Ahmad ibn Fadlan and Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, describe pregnancy markets where Viking traders sold captive women specifically because of their unborn children. The buyers were not interested in acquiring slaves for labor or companionship. They were purchasing the right to control royal bloodlines. The process was methodical and deeply disturbing. According to the Rus's trading records preserved in Byzantine archives, pregnant captives were categorized by the status of their unborn children. A pregnant queen carried what traders called sovereign seed, potential heirs to thrones and kingdoms. These women were sold to Viking chieftains who wanted to raise future rulers as their own adopted children, erasing the original royal lineage entirely. The Laxdæla saga provides a detailed account of this practice through the story of Melkorka, an Irish princess sold in the Brano Island slave market. Though the saga focuses on her adult life, it mentions that she was originally captured while pregnant with what would have been an heir to an Irish kingdom. The child was born in Viking captivity and raised to serve Norse interests rather than Irish ones. Even more disturbing were the pregnancy market's sorting practices. According to Icelandic legal codes, pregnant slave women were subjected to physical examinations to determine the potential value of their unborn children. Women carrying male children were worth more than those carrying females. Those pregnant with twins or multiple children were considered especially valuable, as they represented multiple opportunities to corrupt enemy bloodlines. The pregnant women themselves were treated as temporary vessels. Once their children were born, Viking law permitted their owners to do whatever they wished with the mothers. Many were killed immediately after childbirth to prevent them from influencing their children with loyalty to their original kingdoms. Others were sold to brothels in distant cities, ensuring they could never reclaim their offspring. Dr. Catherine Marie Olley's research reveals that pregnancy slave markets operated with such efficiency that they had standardized pricing structures. A pregnant commoner might sell for 1 mark of silver. A pregnant noblewoman commanded 3 marks. But a pregnant queen, particularly one carrying a male heir, could be worth as much as 50 marks of silver, equivalent to the price of an entire warship. The most chilling aspect of these markets was their role in what Vikings called konungsran, king theft. This was the deliberate capture of pregnant royalty not for ransom or political leverage, but for the specific purpose of stealing royal bloodlines before they could be born. The unborn children of captured queens became Vikings before they ever saw the world, raised from infancy to be living weapons against their own ancestral peoples. Viking law recognized a concept that had no equivalent in other medieval European societies: the legal ownership of unborn children through conquest of their mothers. This doctrine, known in Old Norse as kvíðareign, literally womb rule, held that defeating and capturing a pregnant enemy woman gave the conqueror permanent rights over whatever children she might bear. The implications were staggering. According to legal texts preserved in Iceland and Norway, A Viking warrior who captured a pregnant queen could legally claim not just her as a slave, but her child as his own legitimate offspring. The biological father's rights were considered null and void the moment the mother fell into Viking hands. This created a perverse incentive structure within Viking raiding culture. Archaeological evidence suggests that raids on royal courts were often timed to coincide with periods when queens and princesses were likely to be pregnant. Spring raids, for instance, targeted women who had conceived during winter months and would be showing their pregnancies by the time raiders arrived. The saga of Harald Hardrada describes a particularly systematic application of this doctrine during his campaigns in southern Europe. Harald's forces would capture pregnant noblewomen and hold them in specially constructed camps until their children were born. The infants would then be formally adopted by Harald himself, making them legitimate members of the Norwegian royal family despite their foreign birth. But the doctrine went beyond mere legal fiction. Viking society developed elaborate rituals to formalize the transfer of parentage. The most documented of these was the Motherskipti, mother division, ceremony recorded in several Icelandic sagas. During a mother division, the pregnant captive would be brought before the Viking chieftain who claimed ownership of her unborn child. She would be forced to recite an oath in her native language, renouncing her child's right to its original bloodline and formally surrendering it to Viking parentage. If she refused to speak the words, the ceremony would proceed anyway, with Viking witnesses swearing that her silence constituted consent. The ceremony culminated with the chieftain placing his hand on the woman's belly and speaking the words, "What grows here grows for me. What is born here is born mine. The seed of enemies becomes the strength of friends." According to the Orkneyinga saga, this phrase had legal weight equivalent to a formal adoption, even though the child had not yet been born. Some captured queens tried to resist by harming themselves or their pregnancies, but Viking law had provisions for this as well. Women who attempted to abort pregnancies after capture faced immediate execution, but not before being subjected to a ritual called barnabout, child compensation. The woman would be tortured in ways specifically designed to cause maximum suffering without killing her quickly, as punishment for attempting to steal the unborn child from its new Viking father. The doctrine of womb conquest created situations where captured queens found themselves giving birth to children who were legally not their own. These mothers became, in essence, surrogate servants tasked with nursing and caring for infants that Viking law considered to be the legitimate offspring of their captors. The psychological torture of this arrangement was deliberately designed to break the women's connection to their original identities and loyalties. The most systematic and horrifying application of Viking pregnancy control was the implementation of what medieval sources referred to as ættarsmiðir, bloodline smithies. These were organized programs designed to breed captured royal women like livestock, creating generations of children with royal blood but Viking loyalties. According to the Ynglinga saga, and corroborating evidence from Danish and Norwegian royal chronicles, several major Viking chieftains maintained facilities specifically for housing and breeding captured queens and princesses. The largest of these operations was allegedly run by King Eric Bloodaxe in the 10th century, though the full extent of the program was not documented until much later sources described it in horrific detail. The process began with the systematic capture of pregnant or fertile royal women during raids across Europe. These women were transported back to Scandinavia and housed in what sagas euphemistically called guest halls, but which archaeological evidence suggests were more akin to prisons designed specifically for pregnant women. Each woman was assigned to a Viking noble family, but not as a wife or concubine. Their role was purely reproductive. They were kept pregnant as often as possible, with their children being removed immediately after birth and raised by Viking foster families. The mothers never had contact with their offspring after the first few days of nursing. The Gesta Danorum, written by Saxo Grammaticus, describes visiting one of these facilities and being shown rows of pregnant women, each one chained to prevent escape, but provided with comfortable bedding and adequate food to ensure healthy pregnancies. The women came from across the known world: Irish princesses, Anglo-Saxon queens, Frankish duchesses, and even captured Byzantine nobility. What made these programs particularly insidious was their focus on creating hybrid bloodlines that could be used for political manipulation. Children born in the breeding programs were raised with full knowledge of their royal heritage, but trained from infancy to serve Viking interests. When they reached adulthood, they would be sent back to their ancestral kingdoms as lost royalty, seeking to reclaim their thrones, but serving as Viking agents. The Heimskringla records at least 6 instances where children from these breeding programs successfully infiltrated foreign royal courts, claiming legitimacy through their captured mothers' bloodlines. Once installed in positions of power, they would work to weaken their kingdoms from within, preparing them for eventual Viking conquest. The women themselves rarely survived more than a few breeding cycles. The constant pregnancies, combined with the psychological trauma of having their children taken away, typically resulted in death within 5 to 7 years. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves, with no recognition of their royal status or the children they had borne. Perhaps most disturbing was the record-keeping associated with these programs. Viking administrators maintained detailed genealogical charts tracking the bloodlines of captured royal women and their offspring. These charts, fragments of which have been found in archaeological digs across Denmark and Norway, show a level of systematic planning that transforms what might seem like random brutality into a calculated program of genetic warfare. The breeding programs represented the ultimate expression of Viking attitudes toward pregnancy and royal captivity. The captured queens were viewed not as human beings, but as repositories of valuable genetic material to be harvested for the benefit of Viking society. Their pregnancies were not celebrated as the creation of new life, but exploited as opportunities to steal the future leadership of enemy civilizations. The final and perhaps most psychologically devastating practice applied to pregnant captive queens was the Barnaskipti, child-sharing, ritual that formalized the permanent separation of mothers from their newborn children. This ceremony was designed not just to transfer custody, but to ritually erase the maternal bond and replace it with Viking loyalty. The ritual typically took place within hours of a child's birth, while the mother was still weak from labor and unable to resist. According to detailed descriptions in the Sturlunga saga, the ceremony required the presence of at least 12 Viking witnesses, a Gothi, priest, and the chieftain who claimed ownership of the child. The newborn infant would be placed on a specially prepared stone altar, often carved with runic inscriptions declaring the child's new parentage. The biological mother would be forced to watch as the Gothi performed a series of ritual acts designed to sever what Vikings believed were the spiritual connections between mother and child. When the Gothi would wash the infant with water mixed with the blood of the mother's deceased husband or male relatives, if available. This was believed to cleanse the child of any lingering loyalty to its original bloodline. If no such blood was available, the child would be washed with the blood of sacrificed animals, typically goats or sheep, associated with the Norse god Odin. Next, the chieftain claiming the child would perform the Nafngifa, name-giving, ceremony. The child's original name, if the mother had chosen one, would be formally rejected. Instead, the chieftain would bestow a new Norse name, often one that referenced the circumstances of the child's capture or the military victory that had brought its mother into captivity. The most horrifying aspect of the ritual came next. The mother would be forced to recite a formal declaration in Old Norse, stating that she gave freely her child to its new Viking father and renounced all claims of blood, milk, and motherhood. Women who refused to speak these words would be tortured until they complied, or killed if they remained silent. The ceremony concluded with the Mjolkaskipti, milk sharing, where the infant would be given to a Viking wet nurse to begin feeding. The biological mother's milk was considered tainted with foreign loyalties, so nursing was immediately transferred to a Norse woman, often the wife of the chieftain claiming the child. From that moment forward, the captured queen was forbidden from having any contact with her child. In many cases, she would be sold immediately to distant slave markets to ensure she could never interfere with the child's Viking upbringing. Some mothers were kept in the same household as their children, but treated as ordinary servants, forced to watch their offspring being raised as Norse warriors, while being unable to acknowledge the relationship. The psychological impact was devastating and deliberate. The ritual was designed to create maximum trauma for the mother while ensuring that the child would have no knowledge of its true parentage. Children raised through this system often grew up believing themselves to be legitimate Norse nobles, only learning their true heritage years later, if at all. According to the Landnámabók, some children who discovered their origins as adults experienced complete psychological breakdowns. The realization that their entire identity had been constructed through the systematic torture of their mothers led several to commit suicide rather than continue living as stolen children. But for Viking society, these rituals served a crucial purpose. They created a generation of individuals with royal bloodlines who were completely loyal to Norse interests, while simultaneously destroying the psychological and emotional foundations of captured foreign queens. It was psychological warfare refined to a level that would not be seen again in European history for centuries. The most twisted aspect of Viking treatment of pregnant captive queens lay in the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Norse society's values. While Viking culture celebrated the strength and independence of their own women, granting them property rights, divorce rights, and even the ability to carry weapons, it simultaneously developed the most systematic methods of dehumanizing foreign women that medieval Europe had ever seen. Free Norse women enjoyed legal protections that were remarkable for their time. According to Icelandic law, a Viking woman could divorce her husband for failing to provide adequate support, for physical abuse, or even for wearing clothing she found insufficiently masculine. She could own property, conduct business, and speak in legal assemblies. Some Viking women, like the legendary Freydís, Eiríksdóttir, were celebrated for their martial prowess and leadership abilities. Yet these same legal codes that protected Norse women contained detailed provisions for the systematic abuse of foreign pregnant captives. The contradiction was not accidental. It was foundational to Viking identity. Dr. Marianne Hem Eriksson's research reveals that Viking society drew a sharp distinction between women who were born to the sword, Vikings, and those who were brought to the sword, captives. This distinction was considered so fundamental that it overrode all other considerations, including pregnancy, royal status, or even conversion to Norse religion. The sagas contain numerous examples of this paradoxical thinking. The saga of Egil Skallagrímsson tells of a Viking woman named Asgerder who successfully defended her property rights against her own brothers in a legal dispute, winning both land and compensation. In the same saga, Egil himself captures a pregnant Scottish princess and subjects her to breeding program protocols without any legal consequences. This paradox extended to religious beliefs as well. Viking women could serve as Gauja, priestesses, and were believed to possess cedar, magical powers, that made them spiritually powerful. Yet pregnant foreign captives were considered spiritually empty, vessels that could be filled with Norse identity through ritual rather than beings with inherent spiritual worth. Perhaps most disturbing was how Viking society reconciled these contradictions through what scholars now call selective personhood. A woman's rights and protections were determined not by her humanity, but by her relationship to Viking society. Norse women were persons with full legal and spiritual standing. Foreign captives, regardless of their original status, were legally classified as property that happened to possess human form. This classification system allowed Vikings to maintain their cultural identity as a society that honored strong women while simultaneously operating the most brutal systems of female exploitation in medieval Europe. The contradiction was resolved by simply defining foreign women as categorically different from real women, a definition that conveniently justified any level of cruelty. The result was a society that could celebrate the pregnancy of a Norse woman as a blessing from the gods, while treating the pregnancy of a foreign captive as an opportunity for theft and exploitation. Viking literature contains numerous poems praising the strength and wisdom of pregnant Norse mothers, written by the same skalds who composed verses celebrating the systematic abuse of pregnant foreign queens. The practices documented in Viking treatment of defeated pregnant queens represent more than historical brutality. They reveal the calculated precision with which an entire civilization weaponized pregnancy itself. Every aspect, from the blood-marking rituals to the forced adoption ceremonies, was designed to transform the most fundamental human experience into an instrument of conquest and cultural annihilation. What makes these practices particularly haunting is their systematic nature. This was not the random cruelty of individual raiders, but the institutionalized policy of an entire society. Viking legal codes, religious ceremonies, and economic systems all collaborated to create machinery for the systematic exploitation of pregnant captive women that operated for centuries across Northern Europe. The pregnant queens who suffered these fates were not just victims of war. They were casualties of a worldview that saw human reproduction as a battlefield to be conquered. Their wombs became territories to be claimed, their children weapons to be forged, and their maternal bonds obstacles to be systematically destroyed. In the Viking understanding, controlling pregnancy meant controlling the future itself. Perhaps most disturbing is how thoroughly these practices succeeded in their intended goals. Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that hundreds of children born from these systematic abuses grew up to serve Viking interests, never knowing the trauma that had shaped their earliest moments of existence. Entire bloodlines were redirected, kingdoms were weakened from within, and royal legacies were stolen before they could ever truly begin. The legacy of these practices extended far beyond the Viking Age. The systematic dehumanization of foreign women, the weaponization of pregnancy, and the theft of children through ritual adoption would echo through subsequent centuries of European warfare and colonization. What the Vikings pioneered as methods of conquest would be refined and adapted by later civilizations facing similar challenges of cultural expansion and control. For the pregnant queens who endured these torments, death truly would have been a mercy. The Vikings had discovered something worse than ending a life. They had learned to steal a future before it could even begin to exist. The blood-stained shawl of Guðrún Ósvífrsdóttir, marked with her husband's death and her son's destiny, stands as a symbol of how deeply human cruelty can penetrate into the very process of creating life itself. But if the Vikings could transform pregnancy into warfare with such systematic precision, what other civilizations learned to weaponize the most intimate aspects of human existence in ways that history has yet to fully reveal?